Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for attending this talk on behalf of Farfield Mill. I'm Cas Holmes, and it's my work at the mill at the moment, painting with cloth. It finishes this weekend. I think you're open tomorrow, aren't you, on Sunday? Before I begin, I would really like to extend my thanks to Farfield Mill for going ahead with the exhibition after, I think we had 2 delays, didn't we, because of COVID. And third time lucky, but without their partnership, the exhibition would not have been hung. I think it's really important for me to say before I give the talk that my partner had a stroke late last year, and it's now restricting how far I can travel, and being away overnight is impossible. And as much as I would love to have been at the mill, I have fond memories of exhibiting some small pieces at an exhibition there 10 years ago, 2010. I knew I was in good hands, so thank you for the team there for taking care of my work. I'm going to talk a little bit about the exhibition, so I have images to show you and about the work. If you have any questions, put them up in chat. If they seem relevant at the time I'm running through my talk, I'm quite happy for those to be presented to me while it's fresh in people's minds. And we'll see where we go. So I'm going to just lower my camera so I can see what I'm doing with the share screen. And we'll get started. There we go. I'm just checking us when it's gone through to everybody else. Thank you. Okay. I was delighted to receive these images and see that how the work had been presented at the mill. And given that the mill represents a cloth trade, I felt it highly appropriate that I'm using reclaimed materials to present my work. And those materials reflect not just the places I've been. This exhibition, Painting with Cloth, takes a subtitle to my book, Textile Landscape. And throughout the talk, I'm going to talk about that interrelationship I have with the landscape, whether it's the great outdoors or the more intimate spaces of our garden, or indeed the interior landscape of our home, but how we interact with the landscape. And particularly in the last 2 years, it's been for me a place of sustenance and healing as well. So I'm just going to go through to the first slide, and hopefully everything's working as it should do. So I think it was really important to show you how the work is presented in the mill. You will see a couple of images later in the talk of some part of this exhibition in another venue, just some snapshots. But what I like about textiles particularly, like a piece of clothing we wear, that wherever it's presented, I think that it takes on a new role as a landscape of place because it interrelates with the spaces that it hangs with. I think that's the potential of cloth. We recognize it in our homes, that we drape it in our windows to give us privacy. It's on our beds, and we're informed by that color. And I like that interaction because it's not contained by a frame as a canvas might be, and it's not solid, that it takes up space and in the hands of another person, as with the curating team at Farfield, I get to see it in a new light because they see the work afresh and it becomes something else. So within the exhibition, there are several pieces, and on the back wall at the top, you'll see some smaller pieces which are part of the series of 40 yards. And in the bottom image, you'll see some of the larger landscapes which are to do with the Medway towns mostly, and the wildflower areas and the set-aside fields that are very local to me. So I'll talk about those pieces in more detail later. I will talk a little bit about the context of the materials as well. So again, I couldn't think of a more beautiful space to present the work, and it's been fabulous just to see it. I wish I was there in person, but. And then some of these pieces, when I looked at this image and I saw the window, I thought that's highly appropriate because these pieces are part of a series called 40 Yards, which are ongoing, and they have been ongoing since 2014. The first one was started in 2014, and I exhibited at the Biennale in France, and I was given a 40-yard space to exhibit in, or 40-meter space. And I came home after a long trip to Australia about a year and a half before, and I knew I wanted to make some more works, but my partner, Derek, had a back injury. He's supposed to have been putting stairs up in my loft, and I came back to a house full of stuff. And it was several months before I had a studio, a small studio space to work in. So I was working just on a 6-foot table for many, many months. And I wondered how I was going to make a start. And outside my front gate, I could just see it through my window, hence the window at the mill. The bin men had been, and these bits of cloth must have dropped out of the bin. And on the edge, the selvage edge, word 40 yards. And I decided then that what I would do when I was able to travel, I would use the materials I gathered as I traveled, because I couldn't easily get to my stash because they were all boxed up and put away in the shed. But the inspiration would come from within 40 yards of my front door, the things I could see between my front and back door, so that I combined the world of travel and the world of locality. Because often when I'm traveling, I want to come home. You know, you like your own bed and you want your cup of tea. Actually, you want a cup of tea that tastes like a cup of tea. And then sometimes when you're home, you just want to get out and roaming. That's perhaps the nature of my Romany background as well. You know, you took your home with you. So this was viewable. It's no longer viewable from my front window because there's a block of flats just built in front of this roundabout. But this was one of the earlier pieces, and it's a roundabout near a local school. In fact, my partner and I managed to walk there together last week to vote, and that's the longest walk he's done since his stroke. Took us half an hour. It normally takes about 10 minutes to get there and back, but you know, that was a real sense of achievement. And you might wonder about that bright green grass. Well, in 2012, the Olympic torch came past the end of our road. But the day before, I'd seen all these wildflowers growing on this roundabout. And I thought I'd go up the following day to take some photographs before the torch came, because I really wanted to get the wildflowers. And when I went up there, it had been tidied up. All the wildflowers had been pulled up. Decorative grasses had been put down, and the synthetic grass to tidy it up for the bigwigs that were coming by. This is in 2014, 2 years after. And I love the fact that the wildflowers, or the weeds basically, have just pushed their way through the plastic grass. And I think that that's the absurdity of nature. It will find its way. Paul Nash actually said that about what is more absurd, war or nature. The fact that those blasted trees will regrow, and we can only hope that will happen at the moment with the present crisis we're facing. So I felt this was appropriate because this is symbolic of us having remembrance for those who we lost, and also a hope for peace. So that was maybe about the 5th piece I made. And the materials for this piece came from the Netherlands. So there's a bit of Dutch lace. The cloth it is against is a piece of dress fabric which has poppies, cornflowers and daisies. And cornflowers are remembrance in many places in Europe, and daisies are a symbol of hope and nurturing. And I think it's quite interesting. In the same year, I traveled to the USA. So here we have wisteria in the one on the left. So this left-hand side has got wisteria, and wisteria is out in my garden at the moment. It's absolutely stunning. But like our buddleias along our railway line, wisteria grows along the routeways in Georgia, where I saw it, and they regard it as a weed. So it's, you know, somebody's plant is somebody else's weed. So it's this incongruity about what we think is acceptable and what we will have in our gardens and what we cultivate, I find quite amazing. I've always been a lover of wildflowers. So in that case, you could say my wisteria is just one great big wildflower in my garden, based on Georgian terms. Georgia in the USA, not Georgia in Russia, I have to say. And you could probably see see that one of the remnants I collected was part of an old dress. Can you see the curve? So that's really important to me, that the stuff that I use, in German they use the word stuff as meaning cloth, but the stuff that I use has had a previous life, and many of the materials I use, I don't go to scrap stores or charity shops. I mean, I've been getting them sent through the post, or people give them to me in workshops. So they've passed from someone's hand to mine. And with that comes a narrative and a history that I can then work with and sometimes develop from, rather than the blank canvas. And when I talk about the idea of painting with cloth, I'm building my substrate as I work, but I do work with dyes, paints, and or even oil paints sometimes. So I muddy the waters between the world of what we might perceive as being fine art, the world of painting, and the world of textiles, which is often defined as a craft because of its function. But as far as I'm concerned, it's about how you express your ideas. And some of the best work I've seen has always been in textiles. I trained as a painter. So that previous image came from the exhibition in France, and this is where this particular image is where this exhibition originated 2 years ago in 2018. I think I was in consultation with Farfield as way back in 2018 to exhibit with you in early 2020 to be the final part of the tour of this exhibition. So this was at in Medway, where I live. At the Rochester Art Gallery, and these are 3 other images. Now, at the end, I'll show you that cloth because it's in my studio, where I store some of my immediate works. I have 2 storage areas, the loft and a big shelf above my work table here, where any work that I know is being moved around constantly gets stored rather than me keep going up to the loft. So this is a piece of lace cloth one of my students at Adult Education gave me, with some cranes on them, and we see often cranes flying over the park, so they fly over a house. So again, that's that connection to place. And the second one is images of poplars which grow at the back of our garden. So I said about this being a continuous piece. I think I possibly sold a couple of pieces, or maybe more than that now, but I think there's going to be a lifelong project. I add as appropriate. So this piece reflects where I am as well conceptually. So I've been working on a project with for the Romany Cultural and Arts Company for Gypsy Maker 4, and I had an exhibition which was supposed to tour from 2020. It had its first exhibition in Wales, and then we all know what happened, and ended up going online. And I think it's slightly ironic that an exhibition that's about Romany culture and traveling people ended up going virtual rather than traveling. But that image is of my great grandmother, and during the last real great pandemic in 1922, she would have put a scarf around her face with Romany heritage, and she would have been out there nursing like so many other women during the great flu pandemic. And it's about that idea of that we were helping each other at the time. I made a partner piece to this called Labour and Wait, which was about me waiting in queues to even get a basic bag of flour. Often that first week or so, our cupboards were almost bare because I don't have a car. When I went shopping, virtually everything was cleared off the shelf. But this reminded me that I had good neighbours and good friends who made certain that we had some staples, because where they bought extra, they left me a bag outside my front door. You know, I couldn't just live off tin goods, and it was just not having my cup of tea was the desperate thing. I'd run out of tea bags. So this is about how we can support and help each other, and how my grandmother would have done that. And that little bag on the left with the word Sultan on it is actually a rice bag. So we had access to shops. We were lucky, but there are many places where the pandemic was war, people really had struggled to get basic things. So often when I'm thinking about my own local environment, I'm also at this time, because of the nature of the Romany Cultural and Arts Company project, I was thinking about migration and the movement of people, which again has reared its ugly head again. You know, it's always been with us. You know, the Syrian refugees were coming to our local centre where I teach adult education. So I'm always thinking about our rights to freedom of movement, and we lost that right for 2 years almost, and we're still having restrictions. So this is called a pot of Rosie Lee. So again, it's based on my grandmother. She had roses in her front garden planted by my grandfather, and they're symbolic because during the Second World War he dug up a garden to dig for victory, you know, planting vegetables. But when I was a child, I remember seeing flowers growing between the rows of vegetables, and his front garden was full of rose bushes, which were his favorite flower. He was an adopted Romany because he was not Romany birth. He married into my grandmother's family, and during the Depression he went traveling with her family to trade and do the things that the Romany people did all over the country, and that was his way of life for all the rest of his life. He traded with her and worked around the country with her people while she remained settled in Burr Street in Norwich, which was one of the poorer areas of Norwich. But having those roses were important to him. And I asked him why they were in the garden. He said, this is to remind me of the roses and castles and symbolic painting that I've inherited from your grandmother's family, and the strength that I found through their willingness to share what they have and to give what they have. He said, it opened up my eyes about when people don't have a lot, they give what they have. We only have to look at what's happening with Poland and the generosity they've shown to the Ukrainians to realize that's all anybody wants. They want a home, they want food, and they want family, a safe place to be. Majority of us want that. And he said, I vowed that we need to feast our eyes as well as our bellies. He said that if there was ever another war, I would never dig up all of the vegetable plot. I would always have flowers as well, because we need to nurture our souls. And that was that kind of recognition. And tea was always for me symbolic of people getting together, having a natter, putting the world to rights. So for me, it's always remained symbolic for that reason. And also the first ever resource I used when I left college were tissue, well, you call it tissue text now, but conservation tissue, which is also the base paper that tea bags are made from. So I used reclaimed end rolls of tea bag paper. It used to be made just up the road where I lived. It's now made at Crompton's further north. So these are some of those pieces. So those are much more recent. So you've got a pot of Rosie Lee. There's a detail with some lace and stitching. I use machine and hand stitching. And then you have Great Aunt Margaret's Hopes, which is that little vase of flowers that you see against that again, a rose material. So often there is continuity. Whatever happened in the previous one, some of those materials be transferred into the next piece. Like you're picking up the bits, like you pick flowers along the road, and some you drop and some you pick up again. It's the same for me with cloth. There's usually, when I'm doing a series, elements of what might have been in the previous one, just slightly informing the second one. And the cloth that sits on, they both use a base of the same tablecloth. But this was from an Irish friend, and she said her great grandmother worked in a laundry. I'll leave you to make some guess about what kind of laundry. She said she always dreamed of having, her great grandmother always dreamed of having a lovely vase on a beautiful laundered cloth in her own window in her own home. So this is just saying that, again, regardless of our circumstances, we just want the simplest things, which often doesn't mean rubbing our hands raw, washing somebody else's linen, because that's the job we've been assigned because of our circumstances, and that we can have hope. So it's now going to lead into the second group of work. So you can see some of the body of work. This is again at the first exhibition space. As I said, Rochester Art Gallery. And forgive me if my brain gets kind of overloaded about pieces, because I'm working without a script in front of me. So this was a part of the series of the landscape. So this is one of the landscape pieces that are currently on show at the Farfield Mill. And that was one of the first ones. And it's using a sunprint to pick up the plant material from a wisteria, actually, on the right. But through the back of the garden, the wildflowers grow up right against this great big railing fence that separates all land, our little plot of land, if you like, that's attached to our ex-council house, from the park. It's quite a long garden. We grow vegetables in it, but it's typical of a 1930s house where you used to have bigger gardens and you grew your own food. The yellow cloth is one of the few bits where my grandmother died we salvaged from her house. It's some of her dress material. So I remember my grandmother. I'm not able to identify all plants. My partner's better at that, but she used them a lot and still does for healing. And I have witch hazel in her memory in my front garden, because I know it's the king of healing plants, witch hazel, alongside willow. So there we are. And I like that fragility that you get through the layers of cloth. And I've often been asked by people, why do I leave the edges straight? Well, that would depend on how I handle the cloth, because not all of them are straight, as you know from the piece of clothing that I picked up and you saw the curve. But when I'm working with that interspace between cloth and painting, I also like to have some honesty to the material. So if you take cloth and you tear it, it will follow the nature of the weave. And that's what I want to suggest. And then I blur those boundaries gently with the way I overlay, and then bring in the machine and hand stitching, which is rather like a quilter. When a quilter works, they will often work with blocks, and then the lines of quilting they bring in will be more cursive. So for me, it's the substrates I use are important and what they're telling me about that material. But I don't want to just work with that plate. Sometimes I work more so with some more plain materials, but with the materials just as is. I'm always adding some dye or some paint and some of my own hand to that, to kind of create a layer that juxtaposes the everyday reflective qualities we have in our cloth. You know, it's no strange, it's no strange thing that we have lots of plants and flowers printed on the cloths that we like in our dresses, because we're reflecting nature around us. And also me then reflecting what I'm perceiving through my drawing outside, and I draw extensively. So this is my outside studio. It used to be Derek's shed. He gave me that maybe about 6 years ago when he stopped work. He retired then. He did a lot of odd jobs, painted walls and built walls, put up greenhouses, all those sort of things. He built the entire shed that we're in. The only new thing in there is that red chair, because you always have to have a good chair for being at the sewing machine. So even the print table is an old door that we've deconstructed, and I have a piece of toughened glass as a print table. I've quite deliberately left the left-hand side so you see the reflection of the garden, because if you look right down the end of this little studio, you can see where I've emulated that with the prints. So the idea that I'm breaking up that landscape. So I'm not really interested in reproducing the same type of image that the great painters went in search of, these great landscapes. I'm looking at that intimate relationship that I have, whether they're big pieces or small, the sense that you're bringing that close to you, and cloth helps me to do that. It has this transience of not being, in many people's mind, one thing or another, because we actually paint on canvas. Isn't canvas a cloth? So why is what I do with a needle and thread sometimes considered not of equal value? And I think 30 years on, I'm still asking that question. My first essay, my final essay when I was at Maidstone College of Art, was The Sex of the Artist Matters. And I think it's still as relevant now as it was then. So, you know, that whole idea of that what the materials I work with are domestic, they're often associated with a craft practice, they're with a needle and thread. Subversive Stitch is a book that I'd recommend anybody reads, because it is equally valid. So this is looking out from my studio. You can see my means of transport. I don't drive. I have no vision in my left eye. So my little yellow bike is right at the bottom of the garden, or up at the top of the garden. There are house. And this is just one view of the works of the studio space, and me sketching and drawing. I don't make drawings with the intention I'm copying them. I don't make drawings with the intention that I'm going to trace them and put in my work. I never do that. I make drawings because I need to make drawings, because they make me stop. They make me look at the world, and somehow they gently filter through. I'm not there. I don't want to have these hard-edged, definite suggestions. I want them to hint at what I've seen. So they need to kind of, I'm a conduit for what I see. And I think that ethereal quality is what I'm trying to capture within the layering process. So these are in machine stitched drawings. And that again is the wisteria coming out. And you can see where I've laid one on top of the other. They're actually stitched onto paper, not onto cloth, conservation paper. I've just put in this piece, which you nearly had at the mill. This is one of my unfolding landscapes in process, but it's just to show you how I block together. But instead of blocking colour down on a canvas, I take my cloth, which could have been painted at different times, or printed at different times, or buried in the garden at different times, reflecting some of the colours. So this is what being prepared for an autumn landscape. I did the 4 seasons, and then those strips of cloth become like my blocks of paint, but my canvas could be physically moved around in the space and laid down like a very raw patchwork. And again, I do the same often with my sketchbooks. I trained in photography as my secondary subject. So I originate my own photographs, and often they are integrated into my drawings. I don't work from my photographs ever. I don't make drawings from them. But I will take a photograph when I've been in a space drawing. But when I make that drawing in space, it ties me to that place. So some of the drawings do then evolve as I go back in the studio as me finding my way in, and that's what they are. I'm finding my way into my subject. I might make many misturns, I'll go back on myself. In fact, I find that I often look through my vast resources for sketchbooks and looking at ideas I might have done 20 years ago and thinking, actually, I could take that further now. I'm in a different place now. What would happen if? So I see drawing and painting and keeping a sketchbook as a cyclical event. They're tangible means for me to track my own journey. And I prepared and have lost some of my work, but I would be distraught if I lost any single one of my sketchbooks. So there is one of the original photographs. And always we're juxtaposed with the built environment in this country. You know, we're never far from a pylon or a motorway or a housing scheme or, you know, anything. And this was a former capability brown landscape. I was told when I was going to do a workshop, I'd be staying in a hotel that was on a capability brown landscape, and I failed to find the original capability brown under all of the development, but I kind of felt that that was how it should be, because those who planted those great big estates created their ha-has to keep the hoi polloi and the rough stuff and the farms away from their view, to create this idyllic landscape that most of the American people come to see, which is made up in the first place anyway. I think, you know, this land we live in is layered with history, with time, with the Industrial Revolution, with the motorways, that is so complex. It's never one thing. And this is exactly what it is. This is the one piece that has been used to advertise the workshop, the exhibition, that I sold. And I sold at the beginning of the pandemic, and I couldn't hold on to it because I needed the money. So apologies that I had to ship it to Australia. But this is the one that influenced textile landscape. And they're called the Medway Gap. And the Medway Gap is the piece of land that exists between Medway and Maidstone. And on one side, you've got lots of fields along the railway line. On the other side, you've got all of the paper mills and all of the other industrial, semi-industrial mills and farms. And this field has been purchased. It was one of the first fields that was purchased through the farm at the top, which was the first one set aside by Plant Life, which is a charity that supports wildflowers. And you see these wildflowers looking over the Medway Gap, and that gap between Medway and Maidstone is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And before long, we will just be another extension between Medway, Maidstone and London, you know. And listening to Radio 4 this morning, I think Cornwall is having its own problems with regard to second homes, and people can't afford to live in the places that they grew up in, because there are homes laying empty, 2/3 of a home in one village laying empty most of the year because they're second homes. I'm not going to talk about my political views on that, because I probably lose everybody on that one. So I was absolutely thrilled to see them hanging together, because that suggestion. And I'll have closer images, but they're all about those specific landscapes that are pieced together. And I make no apology that they are presented almost like a canvas without the frame, because I had a piece of work hanging at the local hospital for about 25 years. And it's still there, and it's far outgrown its length of time it should have been there, which is 10 years. That's normally the length of time public art in a space that's heavily used is expected to last, because I had a contract, at least 3 contracts that state that quite clearly, but it's still there because people love the piece. But about 2 years after I was up there, they had a new head of services or something, and they said, could you come and look at that? It might need to be adjusting. And as I was looking at it, I thought, well, I don't see anything wrong with the piece. And one of the managers of that area said, what are you doing up here, Cass? I said, well, one of your bosses said that they felt it wasn't looking as clean and stretched as it should be. He said, I think I'll have a discussion with him. That's why we love it. It has that movement. We don't want it stretched like a canvas. So it's somebody's pre-concept that textiles, and a lot of my colleagues stretch their canvases, their textiles around a canvas now. And I find that unless it's intentional, which I have played around with that because of another project, I actually prefer the undulation getting cloth. What's so wrong about having that movement, that suggestion of folding the landscape repeated because the cloth does it? And so I've kind of played that with that idea that these are unstretched canvases. I've taken them off, but they're not one piece of cloth anyway. So they're going to have that movement. And anybody who weaves know how integral the weave is to holding the cloth firm, and how it works if it's going to be for a piece of clothing as opposed to a heavier weave for a piece of furnishing. I particularly wanted to exhibit this piece. Had I known that the war in Ukraine was going to start during the time that the exhibition, we got it in March. What had just started, hadn't it? So I think I gave you a list long before that. But if you look on this close-up, you might see a little gun. And I don't know what pair of jeans they belong to, but when I was walking through the woods, I found some labels had been torn off some jeans. I think somebody might have just stolen the jeans and threw the labels away. And I took rubbings from the labels because it's high stitched, very expensive labels, but they were all these little machine guns. And this piece is called Flowers of the Field. And each section is about 6-7 feet long. And there's some French fabric in there, some Belgian fabric in there, some English lace, British lace, sorry. So it was exhibited in 2014 in Alsace, which is on the front line between the Second World War. And I remember when I said I wanted to exhibit this, gave them the title, and I said there are little stitched images in of guns, that the committee said they didn't want anything because of their region that reminded them of their place in the war. And I said, well, that's fine. I said, if you don't want it, I don't want to exhibit. I won that argument because I didn't think it was confrontational enough. It just was a subtle reminder, and it proved to be one of the favourites of the region. And I think we're still fighting wars now. And I just think that if we grew more flowers and manufactured less guns, we might find a way out of this crisis. So again, at Rochester Art Gallery, you see how each venue does indeed give a new life to the work, a different life. And that's what I love about textiles. It's like shugging on a favorite shirt. And then if you find, like I often do, I swap clothes or give them to friends, how they seem very different when they're on someone else's body, or how when you move something. I've just recently put some lace in a curtain here because my blinds just really needed replacing, and I preferred my vintage lace, and how the subtlety of the light coming through the lace presents a different way of looking at that space. So this is why I love textiles. It just interacts with us beautifully. And this piece is North Kent marshes, and it's about how often in industrial or reserved lands can be found, or reserved lands, wildflower places where wildlife can continue, around industrial sites, airfields and railway lines. You know, some of it is deliberately set aside because they don't want us to go near them, electricity power stations. And it's this idea that I'm talking about we, the human race, decides what's going to happen to the land. We decide what we're going to be using, how we're going to use it, and what we'll set aside. There's no such thing as a wild landscape. It's all managed, no matter how far it is, even up to the North Pole. Everything is managed. And hidden in here is, you can see, there's my apron. So there's an apron underneath part of this. So this whole idea that we have our own duty to take care of the landscape, to clean it up, the same way that I wear an apron and mop my brushes on it, and I give my students adult education rags, cotton rags and linen rags to wipe their brushes on, so that they don't get acrylic down the sink and mucking up the sink. And when they're cooked, they become like this sky here, part of my landscape. So that's that direct interaction that's always present within my work. So there's a detail, and you can just see the top of my apron behind there. And this is based on Paul Nash's works and writings. And I said earlier on, is there anything more absurd? I've got it. I can give you the quote at the end. It's in my book is here. More incongruous than war or trees, because the trees grow up again. I'm misquoting. I'm just paraphrasing. But this is based on looking at the trees and that interaction between them starting to push back up. And some of the cloth was buried by my friend in France for a cemetery at the back of where her house is. So it actually came from a war cemetery. So it's got some of the colour from that. So it's almost taking that cloth back. This is a detail. So you can see how these are actually old bandages, by the way, that have been dyed. So it doesn't matter to me that when you see this, you know that. It's just getting a sense of what it is. Cloth is about a dialogue. I can give more stories to that place, to that piece when I talk about them. But you should be able to go to my work or any work, artist's work, and take your own stories and bring your own narratives from it. And that's what I'm interested in. There are clues to what I feel and I'm doing. That's why I've made the piece. But my story might have echoes in what you take away from it, but it doesn't have to be identical. You don't need to understand everything that I've done with that piece in order to take your own experience away from it. I don't know why I've come back to that piece again. I must love it so much. And this one is High Water. I think the nature of that piece is in the title. Again, the titles are always a clue. We're all a threat of high water. I grew up in Norfolk, so I know about keeping back high water. I've seen it in places particularly in the late winter, early coming up for January, February, when there's been torrential rain and the dikes are filling up again and fields are starting to flood. But the dark blue across the middle is when I dropped a bottle of Quink ink and just mopped it up with muslin that I had in a nearly said the wrong word there, in a workshop I was running in Scotland, and I just thought, oh, that's a lovely colour, I can use that. So I saturated the cloth before I mopped it up. But what I might have failed to mention in here, that integrated into this is always sandpaper. I trained in paper making as well. I studied in Japan. So these suggestions of buildings in the background are actually crumpled paper, manipulated to make them soft enough to machine and hand stitch. And I referred back to patchwork, and I think that we all work in different ways. And you can see this has that connection to the idea of patchwork. But where it differs is, in some ways, is that my line of stitching is equally important to hold those pieces together as any piece of cloth is, whether it's made into a garment, into a wall hanging, into a bed cover. It's actually the stitch that holds it together. But the way that I choose to stitch is about those lines not just being functional, but directional and visual. So they suggest movement, suggest texture, suggest line. So those lines are equally important to me as any line that joins two edges together to make a patchwork piece or to seam of a piece of clothing. And in fact, I often use seams of clothing, which you can see here, or introduce seams or extend them, because they create another texture, a physical texture, rather like oil painters will use texture in the way they apply to paint their canvas. So talking about this world between painting and cloth, I just put this one image in. This was supposed to be in Australia, but it boomeranged back. I'm going to blame Brexit, Boris, and the backstop for all of this, because I've had 3 parcels I've posted recently, and every single one has come back. I've never had that before. In fact, unfortunately, one got lost and then it got found again. I found it, not the courier, in a bottle shop in Antwerp, but that did get there in the end. Anyway, back to this. This is the index of a book on watercolor painters from 1780s to the 1860s. And there was an accompanying compendium, mostly black and white images of those artists' work, so that you looked at this index and looked at the artist's work. I found 4 women in the entire book. So I decided that this female artist was going to superimpose her landscapes over the top of those pages. And so these are monoprints, which have then been machine and hand stitched of some of my favorite places. And I've sometimes torn out some pages and added to another. There are 40 of them. That's my penance. And they're hung up with just simply with a bulldog clip. And these are some of the other pages made into landscapes in a tin. I've got one here sitting in front of me at the moment. It sits here permanently on my desktop. And I worked with a homeless charity. I was asked to do 2 sessions with them, some art sessions. That might have been 3, but very short sessions. And they wanted something that would be commercial and sold. And I just kind of looked at this charity. So 3 one-hour sessions with a homeless charity, you want something commercial that they could make. These guys and women that are coming off the streets. So I said, would you let me do it my way? I said, I can't guarantee they'll have anything that is of value that they could sell, but they might have something of value of the experience. And I sat there like Billy No Mates in the corner of where they have their meals, just playing around with bits of paper, and people would come up and ask me what I was doing. I had these little tins, because most of them smoked. These were given to me by friends. And still, they didn't make those. I made those out of the leftover tins. But what I actually taught them to do was to make a very simple single fold stitch book that they could put in the tins, that they could then, with a pencil, which I got from Argos, the Argos gave me a few little pencils, so they could keep them in their pockets or a back pocket to make appointments, which I thought was far more valuable to them than anybody else. But some of them did do some drawing with me. But sometimes when you're working with adults and young people, I trained as a youth worker who are vulnerable, you don't go in with your ideas. You've just got to be quiet and allow the people that you're with to come and find you, so you're in a non-threatening way. And so these were mine. I took them in on my final session, say, this is what I've been doing, just so you can see what I do. And I get very angry, I said to them sometimes, that sometimes my work's not taken seriously. So I just put my landscape in, my favorite landscape, in the tin to say that I am a landscape artist and I can carry my landscape with me wherever I go. And, you know, that's important to me. And there's a second one. I only have 2 of these left. I think I made 10. And again, they're using the same process of monoprint from the previous ones you'd seen. And this was another piece that was originally going to be in the exhibition, and thankfully Farfield accepted that that really needed to be at Antwerp, because this is about wind blowing across the channel. So this is wind torn, and this is what textiles can do when you work with it. This hangs on loops, so there's no stiffening in there. It just holds its weight by the way it hangs on these loops. It's approximately 8 feet, or nearly 3 meters long when it's extended fully. But I can make it smaller or bigger, rather like the landscape we force the landscape to fit our needs. This piece can do the same. It can work in one space, it will look different to another because the way it stretches. And again, I like to play with that dimension. And again, these are more recent. These were made while I was on my own for about 9 weeks when Derek was in hospital. I would go and see him twice a week. It was quite a journey to get to him. But you couldn't go and see him. I couldn't see him very often because we were still in the pandemic. So you had to book an appointment, and we'd always have a cup of tea because I'd get there for tea time and they'd bring me a cuppa as well. And so I'm back again with roses and tea and being together. And this also was about that 2 years of having virtual cups of tea, or the few times I had tea in the garden with friends. So this is kind of commemorating that. They're on napkins, you know, morning tea, morning coffee, and afternoon tea. So the idea that right now I would think half of Britain is outside having a cup of tea, or having a barbecue, or going out to a garden centre, or doing all the things we do when sun suddenly comes our way. This is just to remember we need to communicate. And the rose of the original cloth is there, so it's in each one of these. And my friend's mother, who died last year, gave me these antimacassars from her stash. So the story is here, and she and I have a deep love of tea. When we have a drink, we've got a great big mug of tea when we get together. And these are just smaller pieces that just remind me that the last time I was able to travel, that's why I'm excited to go to Antwerp, because I haven't been able to travel anywhere. And I know many of you haven't, but for me, 2.5 years without being able to get out of Maidstone virtually has been tough. And I wouldn't have it any other way that for someone else to come here and take over for Derek, even if we could get someone here. I think I've learned a lot about that process and what I can do, which is including being able to do what I'm doing today. But my last trip out was to Japan, and that was when I first saw masks being worn just to the pandemic. So these pieces are about it's called blue blossoms, but these are the shadows of the cherry blossom coming out even in January, because they had a really hot January, strangely enough. Well, we all had that hot April. The weather was doing something weird. So some Japanese cloth there, some borrow cloth, and me machining over the top and putting in my own element. And there's Japanese text there from the exhibition. So these are 3 pieces to remind me of that. And this is one of the book pieces, Blue Daisy, in the exhibition. Again, folding my landscape into a book cover. I love making variations of the unfolding books. It's a metaphor for me, like my unfolding landscape, that you can carry things in your pocket, you can keep them in your hand. This isn't blueprint the one directly on your left, this is 2 pages from book. One on the right is a blueprint. The one on the left is actually indigo dyed fabric. Then I've done a wash of acrylic paint over the top. And they're real prints from daisies in my garden. So we're back to the symbol of hope. And as this exhibition closes, this work is on show now. I had an opening this morning in Australia and I attended that via Zoom. And I think that just seems appropriate that this is a milk jug and this is called Edges of Australia. And on the left, you can see these are earbuds from an iPod or something that I found the first day in Australia when I was meeting my friend Peter Lloyd, who I'm exhibiting with. And these are all, this was made while I travelled around Australia, and I call it the Edges of Australia because most of Australians live around the edges of the country. And these are bits that I picked up and created these from my drawings as I travelled around Australia for 8 weeks while I was working. And they had Mother's Day while I was there, so. That did get to Australia, it didn't come boomeranging back to me. And this you are familiar with. And I'm very proud to be a writer for Batsford Books. They invested in my writing with a found object. They approached me to do that for my first book. I didn't think I had a writer in me. I think I have discovered the writer and the storyteller after 10 years. And maybe taking a rest. I don't know when I'll write, if I'll write another book. And if I did have another book, I'd want it to be a different book. I think we don't have enough books writing about women artists today. There are hundreds of books about male artists. We need a few more about the lives of women artists. So that's something I'm interested in doing next, picking out some of the best, trying it, getting them to be a book about not just about process and technique, about the artists themselves, telling their stories so that we can leave them for future generations. It's about time all voices were heard a bit more. And however, Batsford did discover that voice within me, and what's more important, they allow that voice, they encourage that voice to be present within their books more than many others of that kind. That Embroidering the Everyday was my pandemic book, by the way. So I have any questions and answers questions coming up.
Many thanks for that, Cas. And this debate around art and craft as a tapestry weaver is one that's close to our hearts as well. And yeah, it's interesting to see that concept of different ways of handling the textiles as well, which I'll take various bits from. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We've got no questions in the chat at the minute. If anybody would like to add some questions to the chat, are you happy to take some face-to-face?
Yeah, if they could ask live if they want to unmute, you know, or put their hand up to unmute. Okay, we've got someone's connecting to audio.
Yeah, we've had 1 or 2 people drop in and out, so I think the fact that this is recorded is going to be useful for those who have missed little bits and pieces as well.
So do we have any questions? Hello, Muriel. I can see I've actually gone to gallery view, so I can see who's there. Then I'm going to ask people, Ben, if they're not.
So we've got a couple of questions. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions in. Alison Day has asked, can you talk a bit about your backing and how your work is hung?
How my work is hung? Might be easier just to pull one off the wall, actually.
And see the backs of it.
Yeah, so this is in progress. Do you know, I know I'm in a trusted audience. I'm actually going to say something that could be controversial. And I know there are colleagues and friends in that group who, perhaps Muriel will be one of them, that when I exhibited at my first exhibition with Festival of Quilts, I constantly had people asking me how I made things. And by the end of the first day, I made a badge which said, "Ask me why, not how." So that is a piece I'm doing based on several pieces I'm doing made out of scraps from the floor based on my partner's healing. And it's got pinned on the back some waste cloth with a simple pocket on it. And it's just going to be hand stitched on the back. Does that answer the question? Yeah?
I think that answers the question is here. So yes.
Yeah, that's how I do it.
And another question from Laura is, what background surfaces do you use at the start of the piece? And you talked a lot about using textiles that have meant something to you, or you've been given or found as you went along.
Yeah, the materials themselves. So majority of them will be dependent on what I want to express. So I can see there's a lovely jeans there as well. Hello, Jean. So if we look at the tea pieces that I showed you towards the end, that piece came from my friends, so that would have been natural. I prefer, often when I'm working with cellulose paste and dyes, I work with natural fibers, but they'll all be reclaimed, so I might have to wash them, they might have wear and tear in them, but I do also work with synthetics and shears because of what I want to express with them. So there isn't one single piece of cloth that I use as the substrate on which I build on. The cloth itself becomes the substrate, and the front and the back and turned around every which way as we work.
Mm.
So
the stitching is part of that.
Yeah, the stitching holds it together. So literally, you could literally say I just break things up and put them back together again in some kind of mad jigsaw.
Very effectively as well.
So any other questions?
So we've got a couple of, let me just have a quick look. We've got several thank yous and inspiring and that sort of thing. There was something from Jenny saying there's a question from Annie. If Annie's got a question, do you want to ask the question? Unmute yourself.
Hello. I was wondering, I love the bottom edges of your pieces. Do you manipulate those edges to make them uneven, or is it dictated by the fabrics that you use?
Dictated by the fabrics that I use. So if they're torn, that will pick up the bottom edge. Yeah, so you'll see that